Please welcome Diana.
Mr. Chairman, fellow Toastmasters, thank you for introducing me. Grandpa George, my grandfather, prescriptions. Grandparents and prescriptions. It's like PB&J, mac and cheese, Ben Gay cream, and arthritic joints. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. My grandfather had a way of just looking at you when you had a problem. You would go to him, he would look you in the eye, he would listen to everything you said. Everything. He'd just watch you. And then he'd pull out a little piece of paper. Always in his little left pocket here, left chest pocket. Pull out his pen, and then he'd write down something. Hand it off to you, and there would be his prescription. You'd almost think he was a doctor, handing out these little suggestions, these ways of living. One thing you need to know about my grandfather is he was deaf, a deaf man. And he could read lips extremely well. Very, very well. Now, he wasn't always deaf. In fact, as a young boy, 8 years old, he lived on the farm in Saskatchewan, about 150 miles by carriage, back in those days, horse and buggy, to get to a hospital. He came down with scarlet fever. And his fever was so bad that his eardrums ruptured on his route to the hospital. He lost about 95% of his hearing. But that didn't change him. I often joked with my grandfather and said, well, in ways that I would have to look him right in the eye and say, Granddad, if you had an opportunity to hear, would you? And he says, Don, no, I would not, ever choose to hear. You would think my grandfather invented Twitter, because honestly, these little pieces of papers were always 140 characters or less. But the message was impactful. And he says, Di, honestly, I would not exchange the last 70 years of not being able to hear to being able to, those first 7 years when I could hear. He was part of the study when the first hearing aids came out, because he did have partial hearing. He wore one of his large hearing aids and wore it around for about a week. And he decided to get rid of it. He didn't want to hear. He said the conversations he had during that 1 week were the most empty conversations he'd ever had in his entire life. He said people just sit around waiting for their opportunity to talk, but they never really hear you. That was his first real valuable lesson to me. It was to say what you mean and mean what you say. He wasn't man of few words, and I take it to heart. It might be why I found Toastmasters. I don't really know. I think he's looking down and thinking, well, Dad, you're saying a lot right now, but it's a little bit over 140 characters. He also said he would never take it back, that opportunity of being deaf and having to move to the city to a special school, because he would have never met my grandmother. And he loved my grandmother. People used to tell him, you will never be able to get with a woman like that. And he never, ever listened to him, partially because he was deaf. But also, he was a believer that if you put your mind to something, you could always achieve it. And he was persistent, extremely persistent. I mean, you gotta think about it. He had to go to a private women's school for deaf mutes, because my grandmother was also deaf. And back in those days, you couldn't take a rock and throw it out the window. I mean, no one's coming to that. He had to wait outside the gates. And he'd have to wait for some woman to come in and out, one of the other students, and he'd have to pass notes. He did this for weeks on end, until she finally agreed to meet him. And from there, it was history. My mom came along about 20 some odd years later, and, well, then I'm here now. You guys figure out the rest. My grandfather often had a prescription for life, and he often joked. He says, Di, when you came into the world, you couldn't walk, you couldn't crawl. People had to teach you things. They had to look after you. Your first major accomplishment in life was just getting out of those diapers. And he says, and then you lived your life. You lived the next 80, 90 years doing the things you want to do, not the things that people tell you want to do, and do it well. And he says, you know what, if you're really lucky, you're really successful, by the time you get to be my age, you won't need diapers. But he said it's from diapers to diapers. It's what you do in between that really matters most. But another valuable lesson that my grandfather taught me, and this is pretty entertaining, because my brother and I, well, we're close in age, but 2 years apart, and we used to fight like cats and dogs, just to stay in the theme of some of the topics today. We would get into these battles, especially when my grandparents were looking after us, my parents were away, because we could get away with murder. Think about it. Got 2 death meats for grandparents. They can't hear a freaking thing. We'd be sitting at the dinner table, eating our broccoli. Josh, you're such a loser. And we would carry on. One day, though, we were up in the living room, and we just had the nastiest fight. Like, we were throwing fists, like, it was full on. The house was shaking. Well, my grandfather could feel the house shaking. Josh and I are going at it, boom, boom, boom. Out of nowhere, up the back of my head, up the back of my brother's head, my grandfather was like a ninja. Sheer stealth. And all he saw me say to Josh was, "Josh, I hate you." He looked at me and says, "Dad, don't ever tell anybody you hate him." And I still have no idea how he knew that. I was blown away, and that's when I had a complete new respect for what I believed as a teenager was a disabled person. Because I'll tell you right now, he wasn't disabled, but he was a disabler. And he kicked our butt. And for that, I do honestly, every time I think about him, just thank him for that. Because he did teach us what family matters most. My grandfather being the most persistent SOB that I ever knew. My grandma, when she turned about 80 years old, actually I think she was about 81, it was a cold, wintry day, Sunday morning, she was leaving church, and she slipped on the steps. Turns out she wasn't slipping because of the ice, but she actually had a stroke. But while having the stroke, she broke her hip. So she was rushed to the hospital thinking that it was the hip that was the issue. It wasn't until later on that they found out she had a partial stroke. She had severe paralysis on her left side of her body. And you gotta realize someone that has to use both hands to speak, especially when you're a deaf mute, is very difficult. Especially the doctor went to my grandfather and said, "You know what? We suggest you put her in a full care home. We don't know if you'll be able to look after her." My grandfather, of course being the man that he is, said, "I don't think so." He said, "She's not gonna know who you are." And I remember us going into the room and my grandmother looking at me, her grandchild. I was about 12 years old, and she didn't know who I was. Didn't know who my mom was. Looked at Grandpa George. She didn't know who he was either. Had a drool running down the side of her face. And Grandpa just looked at her, went back and talked to the doctor and said, "You know what? I made her love me the first time. I'll make her love me the second time." The next 5 years they looked after her, and it was great years. They were blissful years. So what's your prescription for life? Take Grandpa George's advice. Live in diapers to diapers. It's whatever the heck you want to make of it. Don't let people tell you you can or can't do things. Because it really doesn't matter. It's all up to you.